Thank you. Dear honored guests and colleagues, scientific colleagues, I am the convener of the working group to review RGC Phase 2. And of course, that report, the interim report, has already been loaded in on the RGC website, and some of you may have read it already. But I'd like to give a very brief introduction, overview of what we have done. Of course, there are lots of details that I'll be skipping over and that may come up in the question and answer sessions, and some of you may need to go back to the website and study the report in more detail. But this is just a first step in announcing what the findings are. So the review of Phase 2, of course, is something that follows Phase 1, as Ben already mentioned. Phase 1 is more on the macro issues of RGC, structure, goals, aims, and the bigger issues in relation to all the other research issues. But Phase 2 is more on the operational issues, the details of how we work, and some of the things how we work actually affect the research community a great deal. So I'd like to go into that. And this is the Phase 1 review conclusions are important because we follow those and structure the Phase 2 review accordingly. As you see, the current system actually is working very, very well, keeping pace with comparable jurisdictions all over the world. However, there are things that we, of course, can improve on, and there are recommendations from the Phase 1 report, which you have already familiar with, on how work is done, communication, engagement, data collection, impact, and benefit to the community. So the Phase 2 review is overseen by the RGC. The work group actually started in February of 2018, so it's a year and a half already. We engage a consultant. Consultant is Research Consulting Limited, is a experienced consulting firm. They have done similar kinds of studies in the UK particularly. And so consultation by the consulting firm also involved the local academic stakeholders of various types, and you can see that there have been 19 face-to-face interviews and focus groups held over the last many months. There have been 4 sets of questionnaires distributed to different people, different types of people in the community, researchers, administrators, reviewers, and so on. And they have received more than 5,000 written responses and comments. Now, of course, these will then be summarized and molded into the report. And so the working group, which consists of roughly 10 or so members from overseas and also local people, some of them are actually here today. So we consider the consultants' report and summarize their findings, and also injected our own views on some of these issues because the consultancy process is not comprehensive. So the interim report was formulated basically roughly in February of 2019 and submitted to RGC and UGC. UGC accepted the interim report in May of 2019, and the report was released in early July and uploaded to the website. And some of you, as I mentioned, might have seen that already. So right now we're in the consultation and engagement activity stage from July to mid-August. And this is just the beginning, because this is a very brief overview and summary, and the questions may not be sufficiently detailed and comprehensive. And we invite comments, particularly written comments from the community. Please direct those to the RGC Secretariat, and we will look at all those comments and then give some responses as appropriate. So this is the first step that you can actually have a face-to-face exchange of views that will follow immediately after my presentation. The consultant has a consultant report, which is part of this overall interim report. And what the consultant finds is that the RGC operates at a high international standard with good practice. And so as far as the evaluation and distribution of funds and so forth. The RGC handles much larger numbers of schemes and proposals than it was originally set up for. And particularly with the injection of new funding and the new types of schemes that have come up because of the phase 1 review and because of the task force on funding, the RGC itself, the operation part of RGC itself is strained. People actually have to work overtime, not just the Secretariat, but also reviewers and panel members and so forth. And so something will probably need to be done in the future. The portfolio of funding schemes, we have just, the report, of course, interim report was written prior to June 28th. So now that the 20 billion injection to Research Endowment Fund is complete, almost complete, there will be actual implementation and work plan associated with the distribution and appropriate use of the 20 billion. And so the Task Force on Review of Research Policy and Funding, headed by Professor Choi, suggests that there will be a review of 3 collaborative research funding schemes. The phase 2 review work group agrees, and in fact, such a work group to review the 3 collaborative research funding schemes, the CRF, TRF, TRS, and also the AOE, is already underway. The introduction of new fellowship schemes is already underway. The funding has already been secured, and the call will be coming out in August, September timeframe. And the rationalization of deployment investment income of the our Research Endowment Fund has been discussed internally extensively and discussed within the research group in UGC, and some initial framework of it has already been established. So the observation is that the application process, assessment, and monitoring process turns out to be somewhat of an issue as far as the local academics are concerned. So we implemented, even before the interim report was finalized, we had a trial arrangement of the right of reply scheme, which was picked up by the consultancy and also went into the interim report. This was, for those who have been involved in the theme-based research, this was implemented on a trial basis on TRS. Because it's just only a few number of proposals, there's no immediate conclusion yet of how this goes. But we will be collecting information from this round as well as the next round of TRS and AOE from the community, the reviewers, and also the applicants, and see how we should go forward with this right of reply process. As the community may know, that this is a tremendous burden on the review system because it has to cycle everything through once more. And we are already basically overworked in terms of reviewers and so forth in the evaluating proposals. But we'll see how it goes. Another recommendation from the first report is that the time commitment of the investigators must be clear. And this has already been implemented. We have asked questions of time commitments, percentage, effort on each project, and administrative duties. So you would not be working 80-hour weeks, for example, and we would basically be able to commit sufficient time to research proposals, research projects, if they are funded. That's very important. There's a lot of comments on the guidance notes and forms that the RGC uses, and some of them may not even be uniform from one scheme to the next. And there are questions of what answers should be and so forth. These will be further clarified in the near future. Of course, we do not have the resources right now to completely overhaul all the guidance forms and notes, but these will be at least made publicly available on the RGC website, so we will know how the reviewers are guided in judging the proposals and what's being asked on the forms, and how you may in fact adapt to the reasoning behind the questions, those forms. There has a lot of issues over the years about the electronic system for submission of proposals, and also even from the reviewer's standpoint. And that electronic system has already been started in an overhaul mode. And I think by September, there will be a first version of that to be available on certain schemes, and we will gradually adapt this over the entire system. A very important observation is that the community apparently does not see that the RGC is very transparent in its operation. Now, there's no reason for the RGC to hide in secrecy what it does, but I think it's just a lack of information and maybe junior researchers not familiar with the system. And in fact, in many of these panels of GRF, we do have senior members of the research community acting as panel members. So they, in fact, should be available and share their first-hand view of how these panels work, in case you have doubt about that. But even beyond that, the RGC is going to actually publicize how decisions are being made when there are, for example, conflicting views of reviewers and so forth. And this will gradually become available on the RGC website. So the whole process of evaluation and review will be more transparent to the community. Another thing that comes up in the phase 1 review is open access, what you do with the results of the investigations. And the RGC needs to establish effective policy dealing with this. This is in the initial stages. There's no recommendations at this time yet. But just judging on some of the comparable institutions or funding agencies worldwide, some agencies do require that research results using public funds be publicly available. So this is the kind of incentive driving to the RGC to establish a firm open access policy. So without going through everything in detail, and again, you have to read the recommendations, particularly the wording of why we come up with these recommendations in the actual report. There are 13 recommendations, not ordered in priority, but just following somewhat like what the consultancy report has in its order. First is to establish a clear and well-defined strategy of the objectives and operation of the RGC. We sort of know what we are doing and know where we should be doing, but I think it's useful to have a clear statement of how things are being done and what are the goals of funding research and so forth, and be available for public consumption on our website. The second recommendation is to review the entire portfolio of the RGC funding, especially now that there's an additional 20 billion injection to the REF. And this has already been underway in anticipation of the 20 billion. Now that it's actually happening, the discussion has already gone through RGC research group and within the RGC, the UGC research group and within the RGC of how these funds may be used. And basically, as Carson has mentioned, very important, first of all, to take care of the deficits that may be occurring with the lower return of the funding of the return of the research endowment fund. But beyond that, hopefully there will be increases in every aspect of the funding and also allowing new schemes to come into play that better serve the community. All right, but in the meantime, as Ben has mentioned, the RGC has already put some of its own money at this point to sort of head start the increase in funding for these various funding schemes, not to the full extent, but anticipating that we will have the full return maybe in a year's time. There's a formula that's used to divide up the research funding of GRF, General Research Fund, among the various panels. And that seems to be a mystery to a lot of people. However, at that time, there actually has been a series considered by the RGC maybe 8 years ago as to what the formula should look like, how weighting factors should be put in and so forth. So because this is a recommendation and because we have new funding coming in, that this formula dividing GRF funding to the different panels will be revisited again. But it's a complicated issue. So in the meantime, for the next 2 or 3 rounds, we will keep using the old formula while we actually gather input from both the community researchers and panels before we make changes to this formula for distribution of fundings. We implemented a one-time trial of the right of reply, which actually is being used by some agencies in other parts of the world. And this is too early to basically conclude whether this is useful or not useful, but we will continue to look at this with the next TRF and AOE schemes and get feedback from both the Secretariat in terms of workload, panel members as far as whether those are useful or not, and the community as whether this is working for them or not. The time commitment part is one of the recommendations made by the work group phase 2, that PIs are now required to specify time commitments for various funded projects. This is now already in the forms being distributed and in the application process. So this is being done even though it's a recommendation on the books. The Secretariat is being overworked, and as you know, that we have more and more funding schemes and more panels and more money to spend. So it is important to make sure that the staffing level of the Secretariat is properly placed so that all these can be efficiently carried out. We have been using sometimes part-time staff in doing this, and that may not be a very good thing to do, but we will keep looking at this issue to make sure that the staffing level within the Secretariat is commensurate with the amount of funding and the number of different schemes and proposals that are being received, so that everything will be more efficient in terms of execution. The electronic system is the initial stages has already been done, and we've implemented in several schemes in September, and we will keep monitoring it and see how it's going and maybe modify and revise it as it goes on along. And of course, if the research community, for those who will be involved in this new electronic scheme, please give us your feedback, particular written feedback as to how things may work better for you. The issue of the forms that are being used for the applications, as well as the forms sent to reviewers and panels and so forth, to invite comments, there may be a need to review and revise some or all of these forms, because some of these forms may involve different assessment types and different assessment criteria that may not be very clearly outlined in these forms, and guidance to reviewers and panel members may not be very clear at this point. So this will be being looked at, but this is, again, to look at all these forms is a huge commitment, and right now this can only be done gradually, and we would not expect to be changing those forms drastically in the near future, but we will keep monitoring these, and if you have, again, comments and suggestions on these forms, please send it in written form to the RGC. And all of these, in fact, the secrecy part of RGC, I think, can be alleviated if we actually make available on the RGC website all the explanations, description, details of all aspects of RGC operation, including forms, documents, budgets, allocations, funding results, procedures, processes, and so forth. I think this is what the community looks for. Still, what is written may not be completely clear, and if you need clarification, please consult us, and we may be able to make the wording even more clear. But I think the RGC is basically working for the research community. It should not be a separate set of forms and so forth, but something that should be working well for the researchers and for the panel members and for the evaluation reviewers. So this will be gradually being available on the website. The communication and engagement, we already started to have more chances of maybe forums and information meetings with various groups of the research community and universities. And then we may establish a communication and engagement committee to specifically oversee this sort of public relations aspect of strategies and all the functions and operations of the RGC. Right now it's being done on an ad hoc basis, but if more resources and additional staff is available, we will actually take a more drastic look to overhaul the communication channels and how to engage the community as things are happening within the RGC. We agree with the phase 1 review that there should be an open access policy and guidance to university investigators requiring them to have certain commitments to have open access to the research results when they accept RGC funding. The exact details of this has not been formulated yet, but this will be coming sometime in the near future. The ethical guidelines of the RGC is out there, but I think it's not well documented for the research community. So people do not know why something is in conflict and what are the penalties and how the RGC actually looks at the conflict situation and how to decide penalties and so forth. These will be actually addressed more clearly, and particularly remind university and researchers how these are done. But one thing that is underway is that there has been a conflict, a committee within the RGC, a subcommittee, to look at whether something is in conflict or not, whether a grievance or a penalty, whether the grievance is established or not. And then a separate committee determine the penalty. And so that actually is a two-step process and involves a very lengthy study and a long time between the finding and the conclusion and the establishment of the penalty. And so it's being streamlined so that in the future only one committee will take care of both the sort of the penalty phase as well as the finding of conflict, misconduct. And there's been some time delay in the different processes. For example, approval of the next stage of funding in various proposals. And that's because RGC requires certain approvals be made before the final decision for release of funding and before satisfactory or unsatisfactory gradings are being established. So this will now be streamlined so that routine project variations, for example, simple changes of PI that does not involve serious change in the objectives of the proposal or some changes in the budget and so forth. Those minor changes can be handled at a lower level, so the response back to the researcher will be more prompt and things will go much smoother. So what are the next steps? This is the beginning of the consultation period up to 15th of August, and we invite written comments, and all those will be read and properly addressed, and some will be personally responded to. A final report will be prepared for UGC approval in the October meeting, 2019. And then an action plan will be formulated by RGC in late 2019. Now I must mention for this last item, action plan has already been set up for various parts of this report and so it's not we're waiting for the UGC's approval before we take action. Things that can be done right now are being done, and they will gradually be addressed as we go along. So that's my very brief report. Again, you should look at the full report for details. So now we will basically go to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Professor Yam.